When Works and Transport Minister Monica Azubantege called a press conference last week to respond to a Daily Monitor story that government had shelved the much-vaunted standard gauge railway, the country expected to get more clarity on the project. But as the multi-billion-dollar project continues to vacillate from one crisis to another, there's little to assuage fears that the project is mired in controversy.
We are not abandoning, we are not even delaying the standard gauge railway. The delay is coming from harmonization with our neighboring states, and we're already working together with them. We already know who is where, where each country has reached in funding, getting finances from Exim Bank, and at the time when we know that right now, if you come from Kenya, and we can now start from Uganda and finish at the same time.
Uganda cannot build a railway to the sea without the support of Kenya. Where do we pass? Even if we build a good railway and we reach at Malaba, it ends there. But with Kenya, we can take the railway up to the sea, to Mombasa.
The neighboring state in reference is Kenya, which is currently constructing the 120-kilometer standard gauge railway line from Nairobi to Naivasha at a cost of $1.7 billion, about 6 trillion shillings. Progress on construction on the Nairobi-Naivasha line, according to Kenya media, is said to be at 70%. From Naivasha, Kenya is supposed to embark on a 266-kilometer line from Naivasha to Kisumu port at a cost of $3.6 billion, about 13 trillion shillings, and later embark on the 107-kilometer line connecting from Kisumu to Malaba, expected to cost $1.7 billion, about 6 trillion shillings. Azuba says Uganda is supposed to start on its first phase of the SGR line from Malaba to Kampala once Kenya's line has connected to Malaba. The distance of the Malaba-Kampala line is about 273 kilometers. However, it is not determined when Kenya will reach Malaba. Neither can Kenyan authorities tell when it will happen.
The standard gauge railway is still being progressed as per plan. There is so much work that is going on before you see the actual construction taking place. It comes out like we are abandoning the standard gauge railway. We are not, but we have to develop the meter gauge railway for the reasons that you will hear.
The uncertainty is hinged on several factors, among others: China's readiness to commit funding to the remaining sections of the project and whether Uganda's railway is a worthwhile investment. Uganda's line from Malaba to Kampala will cost 8.1 trillion shillings, down from the initial 8.5 trillion shillings. The cost was revised downwards following almost 9 months of protracted discussions between government and the Chinese contractor, China Harbour Engineering Company Limited. Even after revising costs downwards, it remains unknown when Uganda will receive the first tranche of money from China's Exim Bank to commence work. President Museveni was in the Chinese capital Beijing early September to attend the 7th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, during which trip, according to sources familiar to the matter, he had hoped to secure the first tranche of financing for Uganda's project, but he came back empty-handed.
When we return, we send them certain information. I can't give it to you in detail now, that information. And then they will begin to process the application. Actually, they have already started to process the application. But they will conclude now. They will conclude the processing of the application, and then we go to sign. Okay? So, how soon we will go down to sign is what I don't know, because, you know, beggars have not, they don't determine. So, but we are pushing them. The sooner that we can allow us to sign, the better. So, but I cannot stand here and tell you that they are calling me next month. I cannot, because I don't determine their rate, their speed of work. It's like if you went to the bank to look for money, to borrow money. You can't say, you can hardly tell the bank and say, hey, can I come and sign right now? No, you know. They may be making certain calculations, which we may not know. So that's all.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta was also in Beijing early this month for a state visit, during which he was expected to discuss funding for the extension of the standard gauge railway. Uganda and Kenya first agreed to construct the SGR in 2008, but the blueprint was concretized in 2012. Currently, 90% of Uganda's bound cargo, exports and imports, goes through Mombasa Port at the Indian Ocean. It takes a trailer truck an average of 5 to 7 days to move from Mombasa to Kampala. A 20 feet or 32-ton container costing about $3,000, about 12 million shillings. The alternative to both the road and SGR is the existing meter gauge railway, which cannot move above 30 kilometers per hour and whose concessionaire, Rift Valley Railways RVR, was kicked out early last year, rendering the railway operations defective. In making case for the standard gauge railway, government has urged that the new railway line is expected to reduce both the cargo transit times and costs by half. Questions remain abound whether Uganda needs such an expensive railway, especially for a country that relies on imports. Is there value for money?
So obviously having railway transport working properly has obvious benefits. Now, when it comes to the issue of the standard gauge railway, there is an issue of cost and whether we can afford to pay for it. The numbers that have been produced of the debt to GDP ratio in Uganda, there are some analysts that are saying that the debt to GDP ratio has gone above 50% when you look at the committed but undisbursed debt. You could check with the Uganda Debt Network and see if they can give you more accurate figures on that. And so the concern becomes our ability to pay. Then it depends on what our policy is on how much debt we can take on as a ratio of GDP. Now, of course, having the standard gauge railway would have an impact, an economic impact in real terms, both in terms of the cost of imported goods, which means that imported inflation would reduce, and then it would have an impact on the competitiveness of our exports. So if you have a container coming from Uganda and you don't have to add on an extra 4,000 for freight.
The SGR is going to be what we call a mixed train in railway lingo. Mixed train means a railway that is built primarily for freight and cargo. However, it is capable of doing passengers. For passenger transportation, there will be trains, and the trains will serve the major towns and cities along the route: Mukono, Lugazi, Jinja, Iganga, and Tororo. Transit times will be very, very attractive. For instance, Jinja could be done in an hour, Tororo 2.5 hours.
Uganda imports goods worth about $4 billion and exports just about less than half of that. That notwithstanding, Uganda's SGR, like nearly all the big infrastructure projects that have come before it, have been a subject of controversy. The first controversy ran between 2012 and 2014 as two Chinese contractors, China Harbour Engineering Corporation, jostled with China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation for the tender of the Malaba-Kampala route. China Harbour Engineering Corporation, which was reinforced by a group of powerful lobbyists, including from the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Trade Rosa Whittaker, eventually won the battle and was handed the lucrative engineering, procurement and construction tender for the eastern and northern lines, from Malaba to Kampala and from Malaba to Uganda's South Sudan border, respectively. As a remedy, China Civil Engineering Construction Company was handed the western route from Kampala to Mirama Hills at the border with Rwanda. After the tender awards, along came another sticky issue: the project costs. A report released in December 2016 by the Parliamentary Committee on Physical Infrastructure put Uganda's project under scrutiny, with the revelation that the three routes will cost about $12.8 billion, 46 trillion Uganda shillings, to be sourced from China's Exim Bank. The committee report also raised concerns that the cost quoted for construction of the Eastern Line is grossly inflated when compared to the same railway infrastructure built by Ethiopia and Kenya. The actual route length of Malaba-Kampala line is 273 kilometers, meaning each kilometer was going to cost $8.4 million, approximately 30 billion Uganda shillings, which the committee says is comparatively way too high. Compared to other countries, Ethiopia commissioned its $3.4 billion, about 12 trillion electric SGR line, the first in Africa, that connects to neighboring Djibouti last October. The 750-kilometer Addis Ababa-Djibouti line, whose construction started 2011, was funded 70% from China and similarly built by Chinese companies. Each kilometer of the railway line cost $5 million, about 18 billion Ugandan shillings. Kenya's first phase of the SGR, running from Mombasa to Nairobi, which was commissioned last year, cost an estimated $3.8 billion, about 13 trillion shillings. Construction of the 472-kilometer line started in November 2013, with each kilometer costing $6.6 million, about 23 billion shillings. Another concern arose in March 2017 when President Museveni, while on a state visit to Tanzania, was told that they were constructing their SGR at a comparatively cheaper cost, slightly above $1.5 million, about 5.6 billion Ugandan shillings, which was at first interpreted as President Magufuli's charm offensive to sway Uganda to gravitate towards the railway Tanzania is undertaking. Upon return, President Museveni tasked Ministry of Works officials to review Uganda's SGR with the intention of revising the 8.5 trillion cost for the Malaba-Kampala line downwards.